advised a trainer was being attacked by a killer whale.
12,000-pound whale actually pulled her in.
Tilcomb was involved in the deaths of 3 people throughout his life.
November 1983. Off the frigid waters of Iceland, the air is cold, but the tension is colder. A crew of fishermen locks in on a pod of orcas, with their nets and harpoons primed for the kill. Just as they're about to strike, the orcas sense the looming danger. The male orcas charge forward, trying to distract the boats, while the females frantically shepherd the calves away, but there's no way out. High above, a spotter plane with its pilot's eyes locked on the target makes a call, instructing the boats to swiftly change course and reach the calves. The nets close in, ensnaring the young orcas, including a 2-year-old calf that's dragged to the Hafnarfjordur Marine Zoo in Iceland's capital. The captors give it a name, Tilcomb. Flashback 5 years before this brutal abduction to SeaWorld Orlando in Florida. 9-year-old Dawn Brancheau is on a trip of a lifetime. The youngest of 5 siblings, she's mesmerized by SeaWorld's Shamu show in 1978, watching in awe as the ocean's deadliest predator performs before a captivated crowd. That's when she told her parents she'd become a whale trainer one day and work at SeaWorld. But what no one in her family could have foreseen was how this childhood dream of hers would actually come true, leading her to cross paths with the abducted Tilcomb in a way that would forever alter the world's view of killer whales in captivity. Dawn Brancheau, born Dawn Therese Laverde in Cedar Lake, Indiana, had her heart set on one thing after her visit to Orlando's SeaWorld, working with the orcas. Obsessed with the idea, she shaped her entire life around that passion. After earning degrees in psychology and animal behavior from the University of South Carolina, she didn't just stop at studying animals. Outside of work, she poured her time into volunteering at a local animal shelter, caring for 2 chocolate Labradors, and keeping a collection of stray ducks, chickens, rabbits, and small birds at her home. Following her professional journey, she started off working with dolphins at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey for 2 years, but in 1994, her dreams led her to the gates of SeaWorld Orlando. At first, she was assigned to work with sea otters and sea lions, which wasn't exactly what she had envisioned, but the thrill of finally being at SeaWorld overshadowed any disappointment. She soaked up every moment of it. In 1996, she married a SeaWorld stunt water skier, Scott Brancheau, and that same year, her lifelong dream came to fruition. SeaWorld promoted her to work with the orcas. That's when she encountered Tilcomb, or Tilly as they called him, who had been a resident of SeaWorld Orlando since 1992. But unlike the usual captive cetaceans, this one came with a history that hinted at something far more sinister beneath the surface. Going back to 1983, after being torn from his pod, Tilcomb's bad days were only just beginning. Not long after, he was separated from 2 other orcas who were abducted alongside him. They were both sold off to a facility in Brazil, leaving the 2-year-old alone, isolated, and scared. He was shipped off to a marine park on Vancouver Island of Canada named Sealand of the Pacific. That flight from Iceland to Canada's west coast must have been a grueling, soul-crushing journey for such a young orca. Once at Sealand, things went from bad to worse. He was forced into confinement with 2 other older female orcas, Haider 2 and Nuka 5. Both these female orcas were from the Pacific Northwest, where Tilcomb was from Iceland. And in orca society, every pod and area has their own unique signs and language, so from the very start, Tilcomb struggled to communicate and fit in. Trapped and infuriated, Tilcomb's nightmare escalated whenever he failed to meet the trainer's expectations. As punishment, all 3 orcas were denied food, creating tension between the 3 orcas. The 2 older females began harassing Tilcomb, pushing him to his breaking point. Desperate to escape their brutality, Tilcomb often sought refuge in a cramped back pool that was more like a crate, and was the only place where trainers could keep him safe. But the term safe was relative. This pool was a joke for a whale of any size. Even as a young orca, Tilcomb was huge, and the tiny Sealand of the Pacific pools could never hold a single orca, let alone 3 at a time. Every moment spent in that confined space piled onto his agony. Then came the year 1991. After years of mounting frustration, Tilcomb unleashed the first wave of the fury that had been festering inside him all along. On February 20th, a 20-year-old Canadian student and competitive swimmer, Kelty Lee Byrne, was working her shift at Sealand of the Pacific, handling the 3 orcas, when all of a sudden, she slipped and plunged into the whale pool. Before Byrne could regain her footing, the frustrated whale lunged at her, grabbing her by the foot and yanking her underwater. Panic set in fast, as the park's crew made several frantic attempts to free Byrne from Tilcomb's powerful grip. But the whale wouldn't let go, even as she lost consciousness, with all 3 orcas adding to the chaos by circling and preventing any rescue attempts. When they finally pulled her out and separated the whales with a large net, it was already too late. She was declared dead. Up until that point, orcas were never known to fatally attack humans, so the authorities chalked up Burns' death to a tragic accident. But that was a fatal misjudgment. This wasn't just a freak accident. It was a calculated attack, and chillingly, it wouldn't be the last involving Tilikum. Fast forward almost 10 months to December 24th of 1991. One of the two Pacific Northwestern orcas, Haider 2, gave birth to a calf, fueling the already simmering tensions between Tilikum and the other two females. The new mother was fiercely protective, refusing to let Tilikum anywhere near the main pool. The moment he tried, they would chase him back to the back pool, confining him to the cramped space for 24 hours a day, week after week. Meanwhile, after Burns' death, Sealand's management decided to sell all of their orcas to SeaWorld and shut down the park for good, with Tilikum and Nuka being shipped to SeaWorld Orlando, while Haider and her calf were sold to SeaWorld San Antonio. Tilikum faced another grueling plane ride, this time from Canada's west coast, all the way down to the southeastern tip of the United States. At SeaWorld Orlando, Tilikum spent years confined in a tank that was again a far cry from the vast, open ocean he once swam in Iceland. To cover the distance he would have naturally swam in the wild each day, he would have had to circle SeaWorld's tiny tank over 1,900 times, which is a mind-numbing realization for a creature born to roam the open ocean. During his years at SeaWorld, Tilikum fathered 14 calves, and 4 years into this unnatural existence, in 1996, Tilikum met his new trainer, who was none other than Dawn Brancheau herself. Dawn and Tilikum quickly formed a bond, but captivity's toll on him grew more severe by the day. He was trained to perform in the Shamu show, but outside of those brief moments in the spotlight, he'd often lie motionless at the surface or bottom of the tank for long stretches every day, showing signs of severe stress and a lack of stimulation. Sometimes, in sheer frustration, he'd bite at the gates and concrete walls of the tank, damaging his own teeth in the process. And if that wasn't enough, he never felt at ease with the other orcas in his pool. There were times when they attacked him so viciously that he bled, trembled, and had to be kept out of the shows. On the night of July 6th, a 27-year-old homeless man from South Carolina named Daniel Dukes managed to hide inside the park after closing. He somehow climbed into Tilikum's pool, and what happened next still remains a mystery. When the staff returned the next morning, they discovered Dukes' mutilated body draped over Tilikum's back as the whale swam in circles. He was dead, but the most chilling part was that no one could say for sure what happened. Did Dukes accidentally drown, or did Tilikum drag him under? SeaWorld claims that there was no security footage of the pool that night to confirm. By this point, given the whale's disturbing history, it should have been crystal clear that Tilikum wasn't exactly living the high life in his concrete prison. Experts had warned the captors about the whale's stomach ulcers, which was an alarming sign of stress and inadequate stimulation, but the authorities kept on labeling the fatal attacks as mere accidents. Fast forward nearly 11 years after the second attack, and Tilikum was still stuck in the same grueling routine. The massive killer whale was paraded in shows, bred for calves, and tormented by space constraints and conflicts with other whales. However, despite the mounting stress, no major outbursts of aggression were recorded involving Tilikum, though on December 24th of 2009, another whale at SeaWorld killed trainer Alexis Martinez, but the management once again brushed it off as an accident, ignoring the troubling evidence. Eventually, the fateful day of February 24th of 2010 approached. Tilikum was set to perform at Dine with Shamu, where guests enjoyed a meal poolside while the orca entertained. Dawn Brancheau, Tilikum's favorite trainer, was set to perform with him. They'd shared countless shows before, and this wasn't a new gig for them, but this day held a dark twist. As the show rolled on, the crowd watched Tilikum and Dawn's performance. However, near the end of the performance, you could tell something was off. Tilikum wasn't following commands, and therefore wasn't getting rewarded with fish. At the end of the show routine, Dawn perched at the edge of the pool and was affectionately rubbing Tilikum's head, lying beside him on a slide-out. At this point, you could tell Tilikum was becoming extremely annoyed. The cheers and claps turned into terrifying screams. What the spectators in the arena witnessed was Tilikum yanking Dawn by her shoulder and dragging her into the water in the blink of an eye. The panic-stricken staff rushed in, desperately trying to pry the whale from the helpless trainer, but the relentless 12,000-pound killer whale dragged her down to the bottom until she was left unconscious. For the next 45 minutes, SeaWorld's training and rescue teams threw everything they had at separating Tilikum from Dawn's body, but the aggressive whale was unmoved. Eventually, they had to guide him into the medical pool, but this time with Dawn clutched in his grasp, who by now had already drowned. Once they finally managed to reach the whale, Dawn's mangled body was pulled from his jaws. The autopsy report revealed further disturbing details. Dawn's spinal cord had been severed, with her jawbone, ribs, and a cervical vertebra shattered. Her scalp had been violently torn from her head, and along her left arm and knee were dislocations. In the wake of this horrifying incident, SeaWorld Orlando banned trainers from entering the water with orcas. A prolonged legal battle followed, and on August 23rd of 2010, SeaWorld was slapped with safety violations and found to have willfully endangered its employees despite the clear warnings. Almost a year after Dawn's tragic death, Tilikum was back performing on March 30th of 2011 with rigorous safety measures. He continued in the show until he developed a bacterial infection and passed away on January 6th of 2017. In 2013, the American documentary Blackfish brought Tilikum and Dawn's story to light, casting a harsh spotlight on the captivity of orcas. SeaWorld, however, called the film misleading for obvious reasons. To this day, the tragic death of Dawn Brancheau was not her fault, nor the whales, rather the result of built-up anger after living in a bathtub for 33 years. During the summer of 1916, a deadly heat wave has struck the entire East Coast, making temperatures skyrocket. This, along with the terrible polio epidemic in the United States, has driven thousands of people to the seaside resorts of the New Jersey shore. Stretching 141 miles along the Atlantic, this strip had it all, from beaches to boardwalks packed with water parks and amusement parks. However, among them all, ocean swimming was the most popular. Until this time, swimming in the ocean wasn't exactly as popular as a recreational activity, but this particular summer drove thousands of tourists to the New Jersey shores. Little did anyone know that the next set of days were about to bring events so disturbing that they would turn the idea of venturing into the ocean into a worldwide fear. On Saturday, July 1st, 1916, 24-year-old Charles Epting Vincent was kicking back at the Ingleside Hotel in Beach Haven with his family. His father, Dr. Eugene Leroux Vincent, was a well-known nose and throat specialist, while Charles was trying to make his mark in business. The weekend was rolling smoothly, and Charles and his crew were having a blast on the beach, soaking up the sun before they had to head in for dinner at 6 p.m. With a bit of time to kill, Charles figured he could take a quick dip in the Atlantic before the evening would set in. Being there on the beach all day, Charles had ended up making buddies with a Chesapeake Bay Retriever, so when he decided to hit the waves, the dog followed him. Just minutes into paddling, Charles noticed something was off with the dog. At first he assumed that perhaps the animal was struggling to keep up with his pace, but then he saw it turning back, swimming frantically towards the shore, abandoning him. As he continued to paddle and try to figure out the dog's freak out, a sudden icy jolt hit his left leg beneath the surface, and before he could even stabilize himself, he realized it wasn't just a jolt. Something had clamped down on his thigh and wasn't letting it go. His screams tore through the air and didn't stop before he finally grasped that it was actually a shark sinking its teeth into his flesh. Back on the shore, several bystanders, including Vincent's family, were blissfully ignorant of the horror unfolding just yards away. Among them was Alexander Ott, a champion swimmer and the member of the American Olympic team. He was there serving as a Coast Guard, but like everyone else, had no clue about the nightmare happening in the water. Suddenly, Charles' gut-wrenching screams were heard through the air, but the Coast Guard and beachgoers still thought that he was just calling his dog. Soon enough, it became apparent that something was terribly wrong when they saw Charles being pulled in the water. Alexander Ott and another bystander, Sheridan Taylor, plunged into the water, joining Charles' frantic struggle against the creature they had no idea of. In a desperate, bloody attempt, they managed to yank Charles out of harm's way, but not without taking a serious hit. Part of his thigh had been ripped to shreds. Alexander and Sheridan hightailed it back to the shore with Charles. Once they reached the Ingleside Hotel, they sought any available help, but it was too late. Charles' artery had been severed and he was bleeding out rapidly. Before aid could arrive, he died laying helplessly on the hotel manager's desk. At this point, nobody had a clue what attacked Charles. Some said they saw a fin slicing through the water before the attack, while others speculated it could be a giant sea turtle, known for its viciousness towards humans beneath the waves. In the following days, sea captains docking in Newark and New York City reported several shark sightings off the coast. But back then, the idea of a shark attacking a person was so unheard of that these warnings were brushed aside. On top of that, all of the Jersey Shore beaches stayed open without any strong warnings. This was a fatal mistake. Just 5 days after the first attack on July 6th of 1916, 45 miles north of Beach Haven in Spring Lake, disaster struck again, this time even worse. Charles Bruder, a 27-year-old Swiss bell captain at the Essex and Sussex Hotel, embarked on what seemed to be a routine swim 130 yards from shore. He had no idea the tranquil waters were about to become his worst nightmare. Just like Charles, as Bruder swam, he suddenly felt gripped by a crushing force that tore into his abdomen and legs. and before he could process what was happening, he saw the water around him turn a dark, chilling red, with his own blood staining the sea. Doing what he could, he let out a scream at the top of his lungs, desperately calling for help. His hysteric cries reached a woman nearby, to whom the scene was so unbelievable that she thought it was a capsized canoe with its red hull floating eerily on the surface. Desperate and confused, she alerted 2 lifeguards, Chris Anderson and George White, who immediately rowed out in a lifeboat to what they believed was a simple rescue mission. However, it was only upon reaching Bruder that they were struck with the horrifying reality, seeing a young man who had been savagely attacked by a beast that had bitten his legs off. However, unlike the earlier case, there was no doubt now. A shark, possibly a man-eater, was the predator. They hauled his mutilated body from the water in a desperate attempt to save him, but despite their efforts, the blood loss was too great, and Bruder tragically succumbed to his injuries before they could make it back to shore. The aftermath was a scene of even more chaos and despair. When the lifeguards reached the shore, the sight of Bruder's mutilated, lifeless body was so horrifying that some of the women on the beach fainted from shock. Following this disturbing event, the media went into overdrive, blowing up the shark threat in New Jersey shores. Shark sightings surged, reported daily from all over the area. Fear gripped the community so tightly that some people made false reports, adding to the chaos. To calm the situation down, on July 8th, a panel of 3 experts held a press conference at the American Museum of Natural History. They assured the public that while the first 2 incidents were extremely rare shark behavior, there was no chance of another attack. Though it was actually rare shark behavior, the latter part of their statement was again a disastrous misjudgment. Adding to it, the economic toll was already severe, and resorts had to remain open at full capacity without any strict enforcement against swimming in the ocean. Almost 30 miles north of Spring Lake, the town of Mataram was completely at peace until now. The news of shark attacks had reached them. The locals felt safe, as the area's location being a creek made it very unlikely for interactions between sharks and humans. However, Thomas Cortell, a seasoned sea captain from the area, had seen the unimaginable. One day, he saw an 8-foot shark lurking under a bridge in the creek. He rushed to warn the townspeople, but they dismissed his fears, attributing them to his old age. So just like the victims before them, the people of Mataram underestimated the threat at hand, and would ultimately cost them. 6 days after the second attack on July 12th, around 2 p.m., a group of local boys, including 11-year-old Lester Stillwell, were swimming in the creek. One of the boys had brought along his pet dog, which swam alongside them. As they splashed and played, they ventured into a more open part of the water near an area known as Wyckoff Dock. There, they noticed what seemed to be an old, black, weather-beaten board or a weathered log. Driven by curiosity, they couldn't resist getting a closer look, but out of the blue, a dorsal fin cut through the water. Before they could wrap their heads around it, Stillwell's scream broke the silence like a glass shattering. He was pulled into a whirlwind of thrashing limbs and chaotic splashes. The shark, with a taste for humans, had taken hold of him, and in the blink of an eye, it pulled the defenseless boy down into the depths. The group quickly realized this might be the very shark they'd been hearing about for weeks. In a state of sheer panic, they fled the water and raced down to the town for help. Among the responders was Watson Stanley Fisher, a courageous 24-year-old local businessman who came to see the scene for himself. Fisher and others plunged into the creek in a desperate search for Stillwell, but it soon became clear that finding him alive wouldn't be possible. But they were determined to at least recover his body to bring some closure to the grieving family, and they continued their search. After a grueling search for Stillwell, Fisher finally found the boy's extremely mutilated body. He hauled it up and started heading back to shore. But the man-eater, drawn by the scent of blood, sensed another opportunity. In full view of the horrified townspeople, the shark seized Fisher and tore him apart. The savage assault separated Fisher from Stillwell's body, which was then carried away, drifting upstream. Fisher was rushed to the hospital, but with his right thigh severely mangled and blood pouring from his wounds, he succumbed to his injuries at Monmouth Memorial Hospital at 5:30 p.m. the same day. The search for Stillwell's body continued, eventually recovering it 150 feet upstream from the Wyckoff Dock 2 days later. Meanwhile, in Mataram, the terror wasn't over. Just 30 minutes after the brutal attacks on Stillwell and Fisher, around half a mile from the Wyckoff Dock, 14-year-old Joseph Dunn, his brother Michael Dunn, and their friend Jerry Horahan plunged into the river for a late afternoon swim, without a care in the world, completely oblivious to the recent horrors. As they played, a motorboat approached from the keyport, and the man on board shouted urgently for the boys to get out of the water. Michael and Jerry closest to the shore scrambled out immediately, but Joseph was still a bit away and was leaping swiftly towards the shore to reach the other two. But before he could do that, the man-eating shark had already entered those waters. The massive creature breached its immense body half out of the water and clamped down on Joseph's leg. Panicking, Michael dove back into the water, frantically trying to fend off the shark. Meanwhile, the man in the motorboat also jumped in and tried to help. He was Thomas Cortell, the very same sea captain who had warned the townspeople about the shark's danger, but was given the cold shoulder. When he got wind of the attacks on Stillwell and Fisher, he rushed to the incident site to join the shark hunt, but ended up stumbling upon another victim on the way. Michael and Thomas finally managed to remove the shark's jaws from Joseph's mangled leg, which had been torn open from knee to ankle. However, luckily he was promptly attended to by the paramedics and ended up being the sole survivor of the shark's assault. Following the second attack, several fishermen claimed to have found the man-eater, but none of these reports were confirmed until 2 days after the last attack. That's when Michael Schleicher, a taxidermist and lion tamer from a circus, landed a 325-pound shark in Raritan Bay, just a few miles north of the mouth of Matawan Creek. The shark attacked him as well and nearly sank his boat before he managed to kill it using a shattered oar. When he finally cut open the beast, he found a disturbing mix of flesh and bones inside the stomach that filled about 2/3 of a milk crate and tipped the scales at 15 pounds. Later investigations confirmed that the shark was a young great white and the remains inside were human. Authorities identified it as the same man-eater responsible for a horrifying 12-day spree of killing. The panel at the Museum of Natural History, which had previously dismissed the likelihood of a third attack, had to publicly admit that their views on sharks had drastically changed. Now they conceded that sharks could indeed be deadly to humans at times. The main effects of these attacks is how they ignited a media frenzy, blowing the danger out of proportion and growing the public fear and hate of sharks. The headlines portrayed all of sharks as bloodthirsty creatures in the public's eyes, leading to a wave of shark hunting that devastated their populations. This fear reached a new peak in 1974 when American author Peter Benchley released his novel, Jaws. The story of a rogue great white shark terrorizing the fictional town of Amity was likely inspired by the 1916 attacks. A year later, Steven Spielberg's adaptation of Jaws further drove the wrong point home, cementing the image of sharks as relentless killers worldwide. The film's success perpetuated a terror so intense that Peter Benchley later expressed regret over his creation, acknowledging the role it played in shaping the monstrous misconception around sharks. Despite the media's portrayal, shark attacks are extraordinarily rare, with the odds being about 1 in 11.5 million. Experts suggest these incidents are usually due to mistaken identity or the shark's confusion or curiosity, yet this doesn't lessen the tragedy of those who lost their lives. On June 7th of 2016, psychology graduate Colin Scott and his sister Sable were traveling through a prohibited area of Yellowstone National Park with the intent to partake in hot potting within one of Yellowstone's thermal pools, a day that ended in tragedy. Colin Scott had recently graduated from Pacific University and traveled from Portland, Oregon to meet his sister. The pair decided to take a day trip to Yellowstone National Park, stopping not far from the Norris Geyser Basin. With nobody traveling alongside them, the Scotts opted to deviate from the prescribed route that covered thermal areas within the basin. This is an act prohibited within the park due to the dangerous nature of hot springs at Yellowstone. According to the National Park Service, it's crucial for visitors to stay on the boardwalks, as the heat and acidity of hot springs makes them the biggest natural cause of death or injury within Yellowstone. According to park officials, at least 22 people have died from hot spring accidents at Yellowstone since 1890. However, not only did they ignore the warnings placed throughout the walk, walking several hundred feet up a hill in the process, they also had planned to engage in hot potting. Hot potting is the prohibited exercise of swimming in hot springs. Sable filmed herself and her brother deviating from the boardwalk path when they came across one of the hot pools. Colin kneeled down to examine the temperature of the spring when he suddenly slipped and fell into it. Under normal circumstances, water temperatures at Norris Geyser reach around 93 degrees Celsius or 199 degrees Fahrenheit. With his sister unable to rescue him, and herself also suffering minor injuries in the process, Colin died from scalding as a result of the submersion within the thermal hot spring. He was only 23 years old. Sable was unable to call for immediate assistance as there was no mobile phone service at the basin, meaning Sable was forced to retreat and leave her brother to go to the nearby Ranger Museum for assistance. When the officials reached the spring, they found the remains of Scott's head, upper torso, and hands. However, they were unable to recover these remains because the spring was now at 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit, with a lightning storm also being forecasted. The next morning, officials returned to the spring, but by that point the acidic pool had completely dissolved Scott's body. All that remained were a few personal belongings, including his wallet and flip-flops. Colin Scott had graduated from Pacific University a few weeks prior and was a top student, a wonderful person, and a testament to all the values that Pacific University stands for.